People who have spent time in a psych ward, what is the craziest thing you've witnessed? My mother worked in an asylum in Ireland when she was about 15. This was in the early 60s. She loved working there, despite the fact that some of the patients would physically try and her. One patient always stuck out to her. Every day he would tell my mom he was going to her when she finished work. She knew he loved music, so would tell him she was out dancing that night and could he wait until the next day, which he agreed to. The next day he would forget what he had said and would threaten her again, and she'd say the same thing again. This went on for a couple of years that she worked there. I was in an adolescent inpatient facility for 30 days. Two people come to mind. One kid named David who was very tall for his age. I think he was only 13. He insisted on watching Friday the 13th movies on movie nights, and everyone was afraid to disagree with him because of his violent nature and frequent homicidal fantasies. He hated taking his meds, and probably 2 or 3 times a week he'd brawl with the psych nurses over it. No joke, it took 5 to 6 large grown men to overcome this kid. He was scary. The other one was just sad, a girl named Wendy. She was 13, really nice, but she always wore the same clothes and she stank really bad. Apparently this is a common defense for kids who have been repeatedly raped or assaulted by family. They don't clean themselves, or they'll even soil themselves to make themselves undesirable to their abuser. I gave her a big hug every night in the common area when it was time to go to our cells. I've worked in one for about 2 years now. The staff are just as crazy. Here's some highlights. Patient got into the ceiling, couldn't get them down for a while. Patient milked themselves into their coffee. Did you know some antipsychotics make you lactate? The entire adolescent unit escaping because maintenance forgot to lock the gate. Don't worry, they all came back eventually. And myself getting a concussion from a patient trying to escape. They weren't successful, but at least I didn't work for 6 weeks. I was a social worker at an institution that had a hall for what we called lifers. It was essentially for people who had no hopes of ever being released due to their conditions. Anyway, my hall had 14 beds and it was full. There was this one guy who was huge. He was 6'7" and about 350. His name was Simon. He suffered from drug-induced schizophrenia and had bipolar disorder. He talked to himself all day, but never talked to others. All the other men in the ward were scared of him. It was my day to do first shift. I got there early to start on some paperwork I need. When I got my keys in the door, I heard Simon hit the door with his fists. I looked through the tiny window on the door and he in the hall was covered in blood. I panicked and called security for backup because I thought he had ed somebody. Turns out, Simon was in the throes of an extreme manic episode and had managed to walk the literal soles of his feet off. Other medication he was on thinned his blood and led to him bleeding all over the place. We checked the camera footage and he had walked and talked all night. The orderly, who was fired that day, had slept through his whole shift and never heard Simon walking back and forth. A woman I shared a room with demanded to be discharged. It was a voluntary admission, so her doctor discharged her on condition that someone else pick her up and take responsibility for her. Her ex-husband came and signed the discharge paperwork. Then they handed him all of her medications. He proceeded to give her the meds to pack it in her bag and left the room while she was packing. No one else was in the room with her at the time and she proceeded to drink most of the pills she had. A nurse found her drinking the pills and got the other nurses to help restrain her while they waited for the paramedics. The paramedics loaded her up and took her to the government hospital. I hope she's okay and doing better now. There was a guy who was completely narcissistic and managed to piss off all of the other patients by insisting that people who have attempted suicide are weak and should just get on with it. He was also delusional, insisting that he was the CEO of a big company and better than everyone else. After that, everyone shunned him. Many years ago, I was a student nurse and had one patient that had frequent psychotic episodes with times of lucidity in between. During one of his psychotic episodes, he managed to rip out his furline, his catheter, and then threw his glass water carafe on the floor. Everything was sopping wet and there were glass shards all over the floor. I did manage to get him to sit in a chair while I cleaned up the floor and remade his bed with dry bedding. Then I tried to dress him in dry PJs. It was at that moment that a whole platoon of medical students came into the room with their professor to see another patient. This guy then decided that I was the craziest thing alive and tried to kiss me wherever he could while I was trying to dress him. Instead of helping, the medical students just laughed their asses off. Eventually, we had to restrain this guy because he was still in the midst of his psychotic episode. The next day, I had to help the same guy wash up, but this time he was lucid. I'll never forget him apologizing for the previous day. I'll never forget what he said next. "I'm not nuts. I'm a fruitcake, really." And the first thing I thought was, dude, you're a nutty fruitcake. I didn't say it out loud, though. A girl grabbed my toe while I was sleeping. I woke up and said, "What the favk?" and she ran off. I went to the front desk to complain, and while I'm talking to the lady, the girl jumped on my back and clung like a monkey while screaming. It was bizarre. I threw her off me and the lady just said, "Sorry about that." I had a roommate that was in because she became obsessive with her ex-girlfriend. She was convinced signs were telling her that they were meant to be. My first night, she wouldn't stop talking, so I go to the bathroom to hide for a bit and hear her breathing outside the door. Later on, I woke up of the night to her hovering over my bed just staring. Imagine a crazed surgical assistant with dead eyes. That night, I stayed up in the hallway with talking another girl who would later on randomly take off her clothes and run around. Not super crazy, just odd. Was with a bunch of teens on a pediatric ward, but we all had special rooms by the nurse's desk with shatterproof, wired glass so the nurses could always look in on us easily, and the bathrooms had no locks. Myself and another girl were in for anorexia. Another guy was suicidal to the point where he couldn't have any cutlery but a plastic spoon for meals, no blankets, special pajamas, etc. And then there was a young homeless guy who'd been hit by a car while squeegeeing for change. So his leg was in a full cast, yet he still had a habit of sneaking around in his wheelchair and hoarding extra supplies from the kitchen, the kids' playroom, the nurse's station, etc. So they kept him in one of the psych rooms. We formed a weird little club and would often play cards in a lounge area together. Conversations would go something like this. Me, "Hey, does anyone want this cheese?" I snuck it into my pocket so nurse thought I ate it. Homeless kid, "Mine, dibs. Here, you can have these beads I swiped from craft time." Other anorexic, "I'll get you some ice cream and saltines if you find me some." Sewing gear, "I'm gonna sew some batteries into my hair scrunchie for my next weigh-in day." Suicidal kid, "Do you think I'd die if could scoop my eyeball out with a spoon?" And so on. It was a very bizarro time in my life. Guy had a tattoo carved into his neck. Apparently he took a pen in his fist and repeatedly carved it into his skin right on his neck. It looked very scratchy and was still red despite it apparently being pretty old. You know how really young kids grip a crayon in their fist and grind it against the paper really hard? If you made a fist with your left hand and put it below the left ear, that was exactly how he must have done it. I actually did that to myself before when I was 12 or 13. It was the Squid Game symbol, circle, triangle, and square on my wrist. Then a few months later, I got rid of it by scratching all the skin off because I didn't want anyone to see it. I wish I hadn't gotten rid of it though. It looked really cool. Not a psych ward, but an inmate at a jail I spent some time as a trustee at who was very mentally ill. Dude had apparently been arrested after being drunk for the better part of the last month straight and was withdrawing hard as well as obviously not being all there mentally. He was in his own isolation cell, and everyone had heard him screaming all sorts of perverse, insane, and nonsensical since he was put in there. A while after dark, we got called over to do a cleanup of his cell, and what I saw in there was like something out of a horror movie. Blood on every surface, as well as just about every other bodily fluid one can imagine, as well as even on the fucking ceiling, and that must have been a feat to accomplish. Parts of his scalp had been pulled off and stuck to the mirror over the sink, which contained a mixture of the aforementioned bodily fluids and was no longer draining as a result. To top it off, he had pulled out many of his own teeth, which were scattered just about everywhere. I didn't vomit, but I certainly would have if I had stayed around. I just noped out and told them to get someone else to handle that. Easily one of the most disturbing things I've ever witnessed in person, and really showed me a different side of mental illness I'm not sure I'm glad to know exists. Mine is like a kid's book story compared to yours. It's amazing what people do when they just lose it. I had to stay in a county jail to transfer to the work release center as part of my sentence. My first time being in a jail. They were in lockdown already because of an attempted stabbing earlier, so I didn't get out of the cell until maybe 4 hours before I left for the work center. I was there about 24 hours. Top bunk was a guy coming down off a terrible meth binge. He really should have been in the hospital. He was already in the room and sleeping. A few hours later he wakes up and is sobbing, quietly screaming in pain. He was arrested while super high on his grandma's two-story house roof with a baseball bat threatening to murder. I don't know what he did, but typically when they move you, they put the place on lockdown and everyone in the cell has to get up, clean up, and stand outside. Not this time. Like 5 cops came in and just pulled him out of bed and grabbed his stuff, in and out. Same thing happened in the work center. Couple of cops came in and just yanked the guy out of the bottom bunk straight across from me. Saw a 90 lb, 5 feet girl toss one of those 18 liters water cooler bottles, a full one at that, and a bunch of nurses trying to calm her down as she was having a manic episode. It took a few security guards and quite a few nurses to take her down. I'd just been talking to her the previous evening, and she was an absolute sweetheart who gave me a book as a going-away gift as I was being discharged the next day. I still own that book, and I still think about her and wonder from time to time what she's up to do. We're briefly in contact, but she dropped off the face of the earth. A close second would be the time from my second stay in another psych unit in 2021, where a guy was going through alcohol withdrawals and screaming about a bear coming into his room, and they had to lock him into his room and keep him heavily sedated. When he was allowed to mingle with people, he was still relatively sedated, so confused and lost, and kept asking me and other people if we knew what happened to the bear. Pretty sure he was an absolute hardcore alcoholic that had fried his brain, and I felt pretty bad for him. When I was 19 and admitted the first time, I was anxious already and could barely sleep the first night. My roommate was quiet, which didn't alarm me at first. The next day I went to the common room and talked to some people, and then later went back to my room and found that my roommate had scribbled "find them" all over the walls and was talking to herself. I was terrified and grabbed a nurse who tried to talk to her but couldn't make any sense out of what she said, and I asked to stay in another room. I stayed in the restraint room that night by myself and woke up the next morning to a fight in the hallway and nurses running past my room. Apparently one guy pulled out his in front of the wrong patient and got punched. Then later that week, I was cornered by the same guy who pulled out his and asked if I wanted to have in the bathroom. I literally cried after that and was fucking terrified, so I would say my whole first trip there. Another story is not as crazy as it is heartbreaking, but in my time working, I've seen my fair share of suicidal ideations patients, but only once have I seen someone who had completely, in every possible sense of the phrase, given up, unlike anyone else I've come across. He was 60 plus and had spent his whole life homeless and in and out of institutions, living with his brother and his brother's family periodically until the patient became too much to burden for the family. I spent every shift with him on a one-tune, order to have eyes on the patient 24/7, as every chance he could get he would self-harm with whatever he could find. I'm only a technician, so I don't have a degree of any sort other than a high school diploma. I still would listen to him talk for the hours I spent with him, the most nihilistic and pessimistic tangents I've ever heard, a sense of hopelessness and despair I've never considered possible. Even the mountain of medications he was given seemed to have little affect. And then as his hold ended, he was discharged. I'm not a doctor or certified in any way as I stated before, but I can't believe he was given the okay to be released. This event sticks with me because I was left without any answers or explanation of what happened. The next day, his room was occupied by a new patient. Oh man, I wish I could have commented earlier on this because I have some doozies. This is sure to be buried. However, I was in a long-term facility in my early 20s. There was a man named Vince who would wait by the door all day for the senator to pick him up. One day he busted in my room screaming that I stole his Guatemalan coin collection. Bless him. Willie, another man in that same facility, would follow me around and whisper that he was going to me and my mother. Bessie was another patient there, and she would have violent outbursts in the middle of the night. She fought 2 staff members and was subsequently transferred to a more appropriate facility for her. In a different facility I was in, a woman named Catherine would go into people's rooms while they were in group therapy and try on their underwear. I've been in multiple facilities and met tons of interesting people, but these were the standouts. I was in a psych ward when I was 17, almost 18, so in a youth psych unit. My 13-year-old roommate snuck in a couple packs of cards and hid them in her pillowcase. She waited until I got into bed and just started wailing on me with the pillowcase. I couldn't get out of bed because I was tucked in so tight, but when I finally did, I ran to the nurse's station for help. I got out that day. She got booty juiced twice because the first one didn't take her down. I was in the psych ward for attempted suicide. She was there for attempted homicide. I talked to the nurses earlier that day because she had been threatening me, but they all thought she was harmless, so they didn't listen. Nothing crazy really happened, just the kinds of things you would expect to happen when you house 20 people with various mental health issues together in a supervised environment. One girl wouldn't talk for the first 2 days she was admitted and refused to sit in the chairs in the dining room. She just laid on the floor. I saw a total hardcore biker gang looking dude who was at least 6 feet and 225 pounds is weeping tears uncontrollably. Me and about 5 other patients that were close by just went and sat with him and put our hands on his shoulder, but we didn't say anything. There was one guy who thought that there were cryptic messages specifically for him being transmitted through the TV and written in the newspapers. I kept clear of him. Another man would routinely ask me if it was AM or PM. He had no perception of the time or the date. It was sort of sad, and I never got annoyed with reminding him when he asked. There was one severely depressed old man who kept completely to himself, but he would actually talk to me in one specific scenario, when it was only the 2 of us out in the smoking pit sitting on the park bench. He was a very smart man with an entire lifetime of wisdom to share, only in very small doses. He had never seen a vaporizer before in his life until I used one sitting next to him, so that was the worldly wisdom I was able to give him, haha. Each room had a TV in it, but they were literally tube TVs from the early 2000s, big black boxes with a bubble screen, which I thought was hilarious lol. This is maybe a little different than what you're expecting, but the most shocking thing to me was how the system in the US is so scarily easy to fall into and get stuck in. My mom is bipolar and also has narcissistic personality disorder, so growing up she was extremely controlling of me. Saw me as an extension of herself basically. She didn't like it when I went away to college and had cut all ties with her. I was naive and finally told her that since I was self-funding my education and was an adult, there was nothing she could do to control me anymore. Boy, was I wrong. Hours after I asserted my independence, police knocked on my door. They politely informed me that my very concerned mother had requested a wellness check, reported that I was at risk of harming myself, and that they were required to arrest me. I was cuffed and put into a cop car right then and there, and they took me into the local emergency room for evaluation. This emergency room had a separate psychiatric section, and I was locked into a padded room with literally nothing. No phone, no bed, just an empty white padded room. I was left alone there for 13 full hours with no food, and no one came to check on me. I'd had to use the bathroom and eventually couldn't hold it anymore. I was about to leave for work right when the cops came and wasn't able to call in, so I was worried about what was happening with my job. I was extremely stressed out by the time the doctor came to assess me. She didn't ask what was going on, only said that they were going to admit me and asked if I'd go voluntarily or involuntarily. Explained that voluntarily meant 3 days. I started to try to explain what happened. She said that she'd hold me involuntarily then, and just left. A nurse did eventually bring me food, water, and a gown, but it was another several hours stuck in that room alone. Eventually, they transferred me to an inpatient center. They loaded me up in a transport ambulance strapped to the bed, and off we went on a 5-hour drive to that facility. The ambulance guys were the first ones that actually listened to me after the whole mess started. They released my hands and even let me smoke cigarettes in the back with them. The nurses during intake at the inpatient place were so kind. They listened to my story of what happened, seemed to believe me, and allowed me to make just one phone call with their cell phone. Otherwise, I wasn't allowed to call anyone. I called my aunt to tell her what happened and begged for help. Seconds later, I encountered my first other patient, who jumped on me, knocked me to the ground, and shoved his hand down my pants. The nurses and staff were incredibly nice. They gave me a lot of advice. They actually suggested I pretend to be anorexic, which wasn't hard since I was extremely skinny and their food was awful, so that I could have some disorder to treat and show progress on. Unfortunately for me, the head doctor was on vacation, so I wasn't seen or evaluated. I spent 2 weeks there. My family, minus my mom, called and visited every day, driving 4-5 hours each way. They explained what happened, what my mom was like, but since the attending doctor was on vacation, I wasn't allowed to be released. Eventually, my family hired lawyers and threatened to sue the place, and I was finally let go. It was the most terrifying and frustrating experience I've ever had. It still haunts me to this day. It made me realize my freedom is just an illusion, and at any moment I can be locked up and held against my will with no rights or way out. I also didn't have health insurance at the time, so the bill was insane. Took me 15 years to pay off and just finished a couple of years ago. I was not admitted, however. My high school job was working in the cafeteria at one of the local hospitals. One of the duties I did for that job was taking carts full of dinner trays to each floor, wing of the hospital. The mental health wing was always a bit intimidating to deliver trays to, since I was still basically just a kid, especially since that wing was always locked and you were supposed to always deliver there with a partner. You were required to take the tray cart into the middle of the wing to the nurses' station, past their recreation room and a hallway full of rooms. It was about 100 feet one way. One night, we were short-staffed, so I didn't have a buddy to make the delivery with me. I had been in the position a while and had never had any incidents happen before, so I wasn't extremely worried about having to deliver there by myself. I unlocked the door to the wing, made the walk to the nurses' station, and quickly spun around to make my walk out. I was about halfway down when I heard someone yell, "Stop!" I quickly turned around. Initially, I saw one of the nurses standing and pointing towards me, looking extremely stressed. It was at that time I noticed a female patient sprinting towards me. She was a petite, maybe just 5 feet tall and 100 pounds, soaking wet, but had an extreme look of determination. Now, I'm not a small guy, but I froze in fear. My training about having to call a DR strong. When a patient attacks, the staff started playing in my head. She ran right up to me, stopped inches from me. I thought she was going to try and take the key from me and escape. She reached and embraced me with one of the nicest hugs I've ever received to this day. I was still frozen in fear, hands at my side, clutching onto that key for dear life. She then looked right into my eyes and said, "God loves you and He wants you to know Jesus." At that time, a couple of the nurses had just made it to me to try and halo. She then gently let go of me and walked back towards the recreation room. I just kind of stood there for a second, making eye contact with the nurses. I'm sure I was pale as a ghost. My heart was racing. The nurses asked if I was okay, which I was, but I could muster in words, so I just nodded. They went back to check on the patient, so I went back down to the kitchen, still a little in shock. Later, security came down. I'm assuming the nurses had to report that included. I had to relay what happened to them and then never heard anything else about it.